Hey guys, I'm your host, Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to another episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Welcome to April. We're now in the midst of our 15 days of Scarepril over on the Kowabana Patreon, and just last week, the latest volume of Reikan, the most haunted locations in Japan, came out as well. You can find the links to both of those on kowabana.net, but if you're looking for a little more Japanese horror to get you through the day, then look no further. We have 15 terrifying creepypastas related to cherry blossoms taking place on the Patreon, and Reikan explores a different haunted ghost spot from each of Japan's 47 prefectures. Dig into the history and terrifying tales behind 47 famous, well-known, and often dangerous real locations in Japan. Head over to kowabana.net for those links or check the episode description. On this week's episode, we're looking at several tales of the unexplainable. Evil spirits that defy comprehension. Objects that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. Happenings that bend time and space. Nothing makes sense, but you can guarantee that it's terrifying all the same. Our first story for this week is about another dreaded cursed box. Unlike the Kotori Bako, this one appears to be much, much older, and far more deadly as well. This one's called Hell Box. Please allow me to tell you a story my grandfather told me. He works in construction in the Kansai area, and he knows a wealth of associates there. Perhaps because he's so sociable, he buys a lot of strange things from people. He likes to show off, so he has a Japanese sword, a tiger statue, things like that. To speak somewhat ill of him for a moment, he buys a lot of crap. He likes to chat once he starts drinking, and so he once told me about a certain box he'd gotten. He no longer has it, but apparently it had an interesting, if somewhat shady, history behind it. Apparently, it was really old, but strangely, seemed brand new. Even though pieces of it had come off, overall it had been well kept and was covered in a black lacquer. It had originally come from a temple in Korea or China, but that temple was now gone and somehow it made its way to Japan. One of his friends had gotten a hold of it, and then my grandfather got it from him. His friend told him that he absolutely must not look inside the box. If he did, something terrible would happen. Over and over he told him, drilling the point home. You must not look inside. His friend wasn't the type of person who liked to tell jokes, so my grandfather said he was pretty scared. But, being the easygoing guy that he is, he didn't take him so seriously either. The box wasn't that cheap either, and he paid roughly 3 times the normal price for it. According to my grandfather, his friend was in a tough spot, so the money was somewhat like aid for him as well. He wasn't sure what to do with the box, so in the end, he put it in a container at work and left it there. A short while later, my grandfather started to suffer from an increasing number of injuries. Being the summer holidays, I went to visit him at work a lot as well. I happened to be present when he cut his finger once with the electric saw. He laughed about it, but I still remember how everyone else stepped back, clearly afraid. Accidents continued amongst the workers, and my grandfather was at his wit's end. Then my grandmother, who worked in accounting at the office, suddenly said something. I haven't seen any animals around here recently. There were containers all around the place, and usually they were surrounded by nature and various animals, sometimes even wild boars. Of course, we still saw birds though. Everyone soon realized how strange it was that there were no animals around. But nobody knew about the box, so they were creeped out by this unexplainable phenomenon. Then, suddenly, my grandfather remembered it. He ran over to the container housing the box and found a pile of dead rats, pigeons, and insects. Realizing this was bad, he put the box in a nylon bag and went to visit a friend that he thought could help. My grandfather was a regular customer of this friend, and they knew a lot about the supernatural. I always remembered him going on about how amazing he was. I heard about him from both my mother and grandmother, but I didn't really believe them, and I thought they were just being fooled. In the end, it was a massive disaster. That friend still suffers from mysterious headaches, even now, and his assistant was involved in an even worse accident, leaving them in an unstable condition. My grandfather only handed him the box, so it's likely that he opened it, or at least tried to. The box soon came back. He couldn't throw it away, so he took it home and left it there. You might say that it couldn't be left in the one spot for a long time, and although we only learnt this later, apparently that was a good thing. But still, strange things continued happening. First, they started hearing voices. It was a low groaning sound that seemed to multiply. Sometimes they heard it in the hall, and sometimes right by their ears. My grandfather did his best to bear it. My grandmother said that she saw a naked young woman at the house. She ran past her in the lounge room, and then suddenly again, behind her. My grandmother said that the area felt hot, like it was filled with hot air all the time. They also came across small fires started in the living room. They suffered from bad nightmares, and they could hear the cries of a cat somewhere. My grandmother also felt something touching her head as she slept. After they removed the box from the house, this continued for a short while, but then, as more time passed, it all stopped. This went on for about a month, until my grandfather's friend claimed to have finally found someone who might have been able to help them. He ended up meeting a regular young couple. According to my grandfather, they looked like anyone you might see around the neighborhood. Apparently, they were married, and they worked as farmers. Every year they grew delicious vegetables, which they gave away to their friends. My grandfather had the box in his car, but apparently the man was deathly afraid of it. He claimed the car was surrounded by numerous figures and none of them looked well. They were dark red in color and all of them twisted and warped. After gaining their approval, my grandfather brought the box over to them. The man threw up. "Hell is inside that box," he said. He claimed to have once visited a place that was full of evil spirits, but it was nothing like this. The box itself was hell, and it was something that shouldn't exist. It corrupted the earth. It corrupted people. It corrupted the sky and anything else it touched. Its mere existence was something that had to be denied. Even for someone like my grandfather, who was so easygoing, it wasn't something that he could keep for a long time. The man asked his wife if she was okay, and she nodded. Then they placed the box in a room and spent the night with it. He later told my grandfather about what he saw in a dream. It was set long, long ago, perhaps the very beginning of the Chinese Empire, and the box was already an object of worship then. Someone tried to open it out of interest, but they went mad and burnt the temple down. A monk jumped into the fire and grabbed the box while it was still on fire. Then he died. But the box was still open. The gathered onlookers then went mad. One woman ran around naked and laughing as she killed everyone. This then spread to the nearby town and continued until a powerful monk was able to seal the box again. This was all just a dream, but my grandfather was certain that it was the truth behind the box. "I don't think we can help you," the woman said. The box was slightly cracked. My grandfather later heard from his friend that the woman had been possessed by a powerful yokai. She hadn't been harmed, but apparently the yokai that possessed her was rather aggressive. The man was able to see things, but he had no power to exercise them. The woman wasn't able to see things, but she was able to exercise them. When someone wished to be purified or have something else purified, they would see them. However, in order to do so, they had to attack the whole person. As such, they only dealt with dangerous places or objects. And of course, the friend who introduced people to them also received a small fee for his troubles. To me, the man who was able to see things really seemed like a holy person. Apparently, yokai had no effect on him whatsoever, and his wife claimed that he was the only person like that she'd ever met. He truly was special. Even if he had ulterior motives, he considered anything possessed as a danger that had to be taken care of. Apparently, this trait had been passed on by his parents, and the thing possessing his wife destroyed everything around them. She deliberately let something from the box attack her, and then they attacked it. They knew something was wrong when she felt fine afterwards. Normally, possession left her feeling tired and worn out, but this left her feeling better than ever. This only happened with something extremely powerful. Once the being exhausted itself, it seemed to separate from her. Her health continued just fine for the next 6 months, so she was quite pleased. She even gave birth to a child, and they're now happily living their lives together. After that, the strange things happening around the box stopped for a short while. My grandfather's friend found someone in China who collected such strange pieces, and he was able to sell it for several times what he paid for it. Although they were somewhat worried about whether the box would be misused or not. To be honest, I opened that box while I was in the container. Inside was full of thin, dried up baby hands. I wonder what would have happened if I touched them. The man in this next story works as a night security guard, which is an otherwise easy job that gives him a lot of free time. But he's about to run into something that he's not prepared to deal with, and worst of all, something he may not be able to deal with at all. Find out what happens in Approaching Children. This happened about 20 years ago, right after I turned 20. At the time, I was working part-time as a guard for a local security company. Perhaps it was just my disposition, but I was able to sense the supernatural, and I suffered from sleep paralysis at least once every 3 nights. It was a time when a lot of strange things happened to me. I worked as a guard for the local water purification center, and while the area to patrol was rather large, it wasn't an area people could enter easily. I was supposed to patrol the area 4 times by morning, but most of the time I only patrolled twice and spent the rest of my time napping. There was a small prefab building near the gate that functioned as the security room, and although there was no air conditioning, the weather made it so that it was rather pleasant anyway. I listened to my favorite late-night radio programs there, and I also liked to draw things too. It really was a great job. Then one day, I felt oddly stiff. I'm probably going to have sleep paralysis tonight, I thought. And as I drifted off, just as I thought, it happened. At the exact same moment, I heard what sounded like children playing a ball game right outside. It was 3 a.m. Any children should have been asleep, and not even a cat stirred in the facility grounds. Chills ran down my spine, and I couldn't move, so I pretended to be asleep. The children's voices slowly got closer. It sounded like quite a few of them were out there, and I feared they weren't alive. Finally, they reached the building I was in, and they stopped playing. It was pitch black, so I couldn't see anything, but I could sense them. Their faces pressed against the large window, and several children looked in at me. I could feel their eyes looking at me from all directions. Terrified, I closed my eyes and pretended not to notice while I frantically prayed for help. I don't know how much time passed, but at some point I could no longer feel them looking at me, nor could I hear their voices. Thinking they must have gone somewhere else, I felt relieved and tried to go back to sleep. But then, I struggled to breathe. Every time I tried, it was like something was covering my mouth and nose, and I couldn't. Then something rang sharply by my ear, like something electronic. This was proof that something supernatural was nearby. If this continues, they're going to suffocate me. Please, Kami-sama, Buddha, anyone, please help me. As I prayed, I jumped up with all my might. The window before me was covered in hundreds of tiny red handprints, like red leaves from an autumn tree. They disappeared in an instant, but there was no doubt about it. They were children's hands. The sun was beginning to rise, and somewhere I heard the sound of small birds chirping. I didn't really want to think about it, but I couldn't help myself. What was that mass of hands I saw as my sleep paralysis broke? One possibility was that they were trying to check if I was really asleep or not, and by placing their hands over my mouth and nose, they were playing a prank, waiting for me to wake up. Another possibility is that they were angry that I was ignoring them, and so they were trying to suffocate me. I researched and discovered that wandering spirits like to gather in places with water. I worked at a water purification center. Water was everywhere. Not only that, but this all happened around the start of August, just before Obon. Did those children want to play with me? Or... Have you ever gotten lost in the forest? After a while, it all starts to look the same, and for the man in this next story, an adventure collecting mushrooms soon goes wrong when he realizes he doesn't know where he is. But things are about to get a lot worse. Find out why in The Things Wandering in the Forest. Although not quite as famous as Mount Fuji's Sea of Trees, there is another mountain forest that people often get lost in. This particular mountain is ripe with edible mushrooms, and many people go up there to collect and sell them. This is a story I heard from one of those people. When he arrived at the mountain, all of the mushrooms near the entrance had already been picked, and the pickers had gone home. But thinking that there might still be some further in, he started walking through the forest. Carelessly, he didn't take note of any landmarks, however, and was soon unable to find his way back. The trees grew thick, making the forest dark. He wanted to get out before the sun set, so he picked a direction and kept walking. He walked and walked, but everything looked the same, and he couldn't find an exit anywhere. Before long, he saw a figure walking towards him. Thinking that person must have been lost as well, he called out. The figure stopped, as though surprised, and looked in his direction. "If you're lost too, why don't we try to find the exit together?" he yelled out. "If I follow you, I'll never get out," the figure said, and disappeared into the trees. He gave up and continued walking, but before long, he ran into another person. This person seemed much older. Yet, when he called out, they replied, "I hate this! Let me out!" and ran off. No idea what was going on, he continued walking and then ran into another person. This person was quite elderly, and this time he approached him first. "If we go one of these ways, we should be able to get out. Which way are you going to go?" He looked at the paths splitting off through the trees and chose the path leading right. "That's probably the correct answer. Good," the old man said, and then disappeared into the trees. As he walked along the path, it miraculously led him back to where he began. But strangely, not a lot of time had passed. When he got back to the inn, he told one of the employees about what had happened. Apparently, they were worried about him. "Thank God you're safe. Normally, once people go into those woods, they don't come back out," they said. He thought they were being a little overdramatic, but lots of people really did go missing there, and he remembered those he'd come across while lost himself. "I need to go back and find them," he said, but the employee shook his head. "They're no doubt already gone." He found that phrase odd. How could they be already gone? "I fear they were future versions of you, lost forever in the forest," the employee said. It was true. In the darkness, he couldn't see their faces very well, and all of them were wearing clothes similar to his as well. Running into a younger version of themselves over and over, and being unable to find a way out must have driven them mad. When he ran into the oldest version of himself and made the opposite choice that he had when he was younger, he must have been satisfied knowing that this time he would get out. It seemed that while time stopped in the forest and nobody ever got hungry, it was, on the other hand, difficult to die, and people still continued to age regardless. And because he was able to find his way out finally, the older versions of him were no longer stuck, and thus disappeared. A chill ran down his spine as he considered the possibility that he may have ended up suffering the same fate as them. Old, large trees are often considered to be sacred in Japan. Trees that manage to live for so long are said to have the spirit of a kami residing within them, so you shouldn't cut them down. In this next story, a Shinto priest warns his followers that this year will be a bad year for cutting down large trees. And well, find out what happens in You Mustn't Cut Large Trees. They say that the power of gods reside in large trees, and this is a story about something that happened to me that made me believe that that could be true. There's a Shinto sect in the west of Tokyo that's rather famous. You may have heard of them, and they've looked after me ever since I was a child. It's not like I really believe in their ideals or anything, but they took care of my grandfather for his entire life, and they never asked for money or anything. So they seem to be good people at the very least. Even now, I still go back and see them once every few years to get some advice and see how everyone is doing. When I was a kid, our relatives gathered every year for New Year's, and we all went for our first shrine visit of the year together. There were so many of us that we formed a line to enter, and once we were all inside, the head priest, we called him sensei, would speak and then perform a simple purification ritual for us all. He never spoke about anything too deep, just warned us that times were dark and to take care, that sort of thing. He didn't speak of anything religious. It was more like listening to a high school teacher give a speech. Yet, when I was in the 3rd grade of elementary school, he gave a rare talk that touched on the occult. "This year, you mustn't cut down large trees," he said. It was so strange that even now I still remember it. But at the time I was just a kid, so I soon forgot about it. When April came around, I started a new school year. I became friends with a girl named Y-chan. Her house had just been newly built that year, and it was massive, like a mansion. It had a loft, 2 sets of stairs, a large living room, and an atrium. I'd only ever lived in apartments, so I was jealous. The yard wasn't so big, but it kind of reminded me of a European castle, with large trees surrounding it. Apparently, her father was an architect, and he had designed it himself. I went over there a few times to play, but by July, Y-chan had started to miss a lot of school. By the new school term, she stopped coming entirely. Apparently, she'd been hospitalized with an autoimmune disease. Up until then, she'd been a normal, healthy child, and I'd never known anyone to be hospitalized, so I was shocked. We made paper cranes for her in class, but not even 2 weeks had passed when we received the news that she had passed away. We attended her funeral as a class. An altar was set up in the family living room, and we watched the service from the loft. I could see the greenery of the trees through the window, and even then I was like, this place really is surrounded by trees. A short while later, her parents came to see us, and they asked us not to forget about Y-chan. Even to my childlike eyes, her father seemed grand and dignified. Yet, not even 1 month later, he suddenly died of a heart attack. When he didn't come home from work, his wife went out to find him, and he was passed out on his desk in front of a photo of Y-chan. When I heard that, a picture of Y-chan's new house came to mind, and chills ran down my spine. To build such a large house, they must have cut down numerous large trees. I don't know what happened to her mother or younger brother. They sold the house before a year had even passed and moved away. I later heard about other people who had died after cutting down large trees, but that's a story for another day. Have you ever felt a presence behind you when you're walking down a flight of stairs, only to turn around and nothing's there? The young man in this next story experiences that exact same thing, only for it to end in tragedy mere moments later. Find out why in Crushed Leg. This happened when I was in the second grade of university. After lectures for the day were over, I went to a friend's house so we could have a yakiniku party. He invited 5 people, but only 2 turned up. Other than A-san, who arranged the party, there was O-san, a nerd who always liked to carry around his favorite figures, and myself. As we were on the train towards his house, he pointed out the window and said, "That's where I live." There was one particular building that stood out from all the others. It was large and painted orange. We got off at the next station, and the closer we got to his building, the more expensive and fashionable it looked. There was a supermarket on the premises, so we picked up the meat we needed for the party. When we stepped outside, I pointed to the building in front of us. "Ah, that's where you live, isn't it?" Yet, he didn't answer me. I looked over at him, and A-san was looking at me strangely, like he didn't know what I was talking about. Well, that was to be expected, I guess. I wasn't pointing at the stylish orange building, but at an old, white apartment complex instead. I didn't even know why I pointed to that one, but the mood flipped on its head in an instant. Then A suddenly muttered something. Come to think of it, a lot of people have jumped to their deaths from that building. Thinking back on it now, that was probably the moment I started to feel scared. We walked a short distance and went to his apartment on the 3rd floor. I waited in the living room while he prepared the meat. Osan was already there, so we watched TV together while we waited. A short while later, there was a sudden bang at the front door. "Maybe Mum's home," Asan said, so Osan and I turned to look at the living room door. We planned to greet her when she came in. Before long, the doorknob rattled and the door opened. But that was it. There was nobody on the other side. The two of us screamed and ran into the kitchen, explaining to Asan what had just happened. The 3 of us went to the front door to check. It was still locked, so nobody had come inside. After that, we heard banging sounds from around the house and noises from empty rooms. We tried to ignore it and just enjoy the meat. The party finished late into the night. Being so late, Asan said that he would drop us off at the station and we left his house together. I don't remember if the building had an elevator, but we took the stairs, and as we did, I sensed something behind us. Asan went first, followed by Osan, and then me, so there shouldn't have been anyone else behind me. Creeped out, there were only 5 more floors to go before we reached the bottom. I didn't know what happened, but for a moment, it felt like something had grabbed my legs, and I couldn't go forward any further. I tumbled face first down the stairs, yet my ankles hurt more than anything else. Asan and Osan came running back to check on me. "You tripped? Are you okay?" they said. But the moment they saw me, they suddenly screamed and pointed. I knew what they were pointing at. My ankle. I slowly turned to look at it myself, and a voiceless scream came out. My leg looked soft like clay, bent into a strange shape. I quickly fumbled for it, trying to put it back to normal. I was so scared that all I could think about was quickly fixing it. My mind went blank. I got my leg mostly back to normal, and the 2 of them helped me the rest of the way to the station. I didn't want to bother them any more than that, so we said our goodbyes. Thankfully, I still don't know how, but my bone wasn't actually broken. I called my parents. My mother was sensitive to the supernatural, and she guessed what type of situation I was in at the time. After I hung up, I was suddenly overtaken by an urge to jump onto the tracks. I had no idea why. I couldn't allow that to happen. Battling it the entire way, I somehow safely got home. Yet the strangeness continued there as well. The bathroom lights turned on and off, and I heard strange voices as well. Then at some point, they suddenly disappeared. The memories have started to fade now, but I'll never forget them. For you see, my leg never healed properly after that, and even now, it still has various lumps and bumps in it. Our last story for this week is a reminder that you don't necessarily have to seek curses out. Sometimes they just happen to find you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. This one's called, I Think My Friend is Cursed. We always do things together, so I'm definitely in danger too. Give me a break. It's not like I've done anything different to usual. I went to a famous local shrine today to be purified. This all started because we visited a certain place and the chief priest told us never to go there again. I have a friend that I've been close to ever since junior high. During the summer holidays, we were bored and got to talking about doing something we'd never done before. We're both indoor people, but we talked about doing something outdoorsy instead. We decided to go camping. There was clearly something at the campgrounds other than us, and we talked about going to have ourselves purified when we got back. Yet, once we got home, I lost contact with him. Several days passed with no word, so I decided to speak to his parents. Apparently, he'd gotten into some trouble with the law, but they hadn't taken him back to the station. No, he'd been involuntarily committed to the psych ward instead. He was always such a calm, quiet guy, so it was unbelievable that he would do something to get in trouble with the police. The campgrounds were close to the lake. We were drinking sake there around 11 p.m., I think. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but there was what appeared to be someone in the water, beckoning for us to come over. I'd love if someone could tell me what that was. The priest I saw at the shrine today wouldn't say anything, although he did say it was a pretty dangerous spiritual area. To be honest, after we saw the spirit or whatever it was, my friend started acting weird. It's hard to think those events aren't related. I mentioned it earlier, but we've known each other since junior high, and he's a very quiet type of guy. I've never seen him get into a fight, and he doesn't speak ill of others either. But even after we graduated high school, neither of us were able to get a girlfriend, and he seemed upset about that. That was around the time we rented a car and went to the campgrounds. Neither of us usually drove, so we picked a campground in the neighboring prefecture. He looked it up on the internet and found a nice place with a small lake attached. At the end of last month, we went to the nearby home center and picked up a tent and some tools, and then at the start of the month, made our way out. We arrived just before noon. We put the tent up and had a barbecue. It was the first time camping for either of us, and although we got an easy to put up tent, we forgot the hammer for the steaks, and we struggled to get a fire going for the barbecue as well. It was a battle right from the very start. Still, we were both men, and a little struggle was fun. We enjoyed the meat as it cooked. We put everything away after lunch and, with nothing else to do, decided to go for a walk. The lake was so small that we could walk around it in about 20 or 30 minutes. But the scenery was nice, and with little detours, it took us about an hour all up. We didn't notice anything strange at the time. If I had to say anything, we noticed a small shrine, and that was it. But that sort of thing isn't exactly rare, so we didn't find it odd. We had fun, and nothing was out of the ordinary. The campgrounds were so empty that only 2 other groups showed up, and they set up far away from us. We were set up right in front of the lake, while they set up much further back. We chatted about how beautiful it was there and how we'd picked such a great spot. Honestly, we should have set our tent up in the same area as them. It grew chilly as night fell, and we prepared another barbecue for dinner. Again, we struggled with the fire, and by the time we started eating, the fire had mostly gone out. But the stars were beautiful, and we chatted for a few hours while sharing some drinks before I figured it was time to call it a night. My friend said that he wanted to enjoy the scenery a little more, however. Opportunities like this didn't come around every day. He walked over to the lake's edge, so I joined him. The 2 of us stood there and, yeah, it looked real nice, I thought. We looked out over the water for about 10 minutes in silence. I saw a shooting star and was about to suggest we go to bed when, suddenly, in a small voice, my friend said, "Hey." He was pointing to something in the water. I'd mostly been looking at the sky, so I turned my eyes downward. There was a dark figure in the middle of the lake, waving back and forth. Instinctively, I felt like we'd seen something that we shouldn't have. A chill ran down my spine. A slim, dark figure waved furiously back and forth in the middle of the lake. "That's a person, right?" my friend said, but there was no way anyone would be out there at that time of night. I knew it wasn't something we should be looking at, but I couldn't turn away either. I stared at it for a bit, and it was clear that the top half of the figure was poking out of the water, and it was motioning for us to come closer. But its arm was far too long and slender to be that of a human. I got scared, but I didn't exactly feel like going to sleep in the tent either. My friend was also scared, so I suggested we get in the car and get out of there, but he refused. "We've been drinking, and we have to check out with reception before we go anyway." We had no choice but to stay. I was so terrified I didn't know what to do. We went back to the tent and discussed what that thing might have been. We both thought it had to be a ghost, but we did our best to come up with some sort of other, more rational explanation. We decided that the most believable thing was a tree waving in the water. We'd both been drinking, after all. We were both scared, but we decided to stay up all night chatting until the sun rose. That was the goal, anyway, but at some point, we apparently fell asleep. The sound of the wind outside woke me up, and I realized the lantern light had gone out. It was still dark, so I grabbed my phone to see what time it was. As I pressed the button and it lit up, I saw my friend staring at me in the darkness, frightening me. The light was dim, but his eyes were wide open, and he was grinning. I thought he was just messing around, and I said in a loud voice, "What the hell are you doing?" Suddenly he seemed to snap out of it, and he looked at me, confused. "What the hell were you grinning about?" I snapped, but he honestly didn't seem to know what I was talking about. Maybe he had been half asleep, I wondered, but no matter how you looked at it, he had been staring and grinning at me. This was around the point where he started acting strange. We were both frightened, but there was no point in staying awake any longer. I told him we should get some more sleep. "Do you hear something?" he said. I listened closer, but I couldn't hear anything. "No." "Oh," he replied, and then fell silent. Next thing I knew, my phone alarm was waking me up. I must have only slept for about 2 or 3 hours, but apparently my friend hadn't slept at all. He said a voice outside the tent was calling to him all night, and he couldn't sleep. Scared, we went to talk to one of the campground workers about what happened the night before. They didn't want to say much because campers would stop coming, but apparently the shrine we saw was dedicated to some spirit or kami, and not a very nice one. At any rate, he said, we should go to a reputable shrine once we got back for cleansing. There was a famous one close to where we lived, so we discussed heading there as soon as we got back. After that, well, I mentioned earlier how it went. We each returned home, and I lost contact with him. At first I didn't want to tell his parents about what happened, but realizing how bad things were, I told them, and then that was when they told me he had gotten into trouble with the police. His mother had only heard bits and pieces about it from the old ladies around town, but even she didn't know what had happened. They still haven't heard from him either. And as for me, I went to that shrine today to have myself cleansed. Don't forget to pick up your copy of Deikan, The Most Haunted Locations in Japan, Volume 2, available now on Amazon, and entirely free to read if you have Kindle Unlimited as well. You can also grab this month's special 15 Days of Scarepril that is currently ongoing for as little as $1 at patreon.com/TaraADevlin. Stay safe, everyone, and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.